Okay, so now we are moving on to how well did the early republic deal with problems from 1783 to 1789. So this one is probably a bit of a one-sided one because I don't think you can make, unless you want to go pure revisionism, I don't think you can make a massively good case for the Articles of Confederation. So the important thing for students on this one as well is the dates on these kind of questions, because they call the early republic both the period of the Articles of Confederation and Washington's first presidency. So obviously the Articles of Confederation is 1783 to 1789, and Washington's presidency is 89 to 96, basically. So I'll set it up again. Obviously, you've got three big problems we talked about: Western territories and the economic problems. We talked about both of those coming up. The divisions are not something they were really focused on solving this early, because it was not, again, as we described before, it was latent. So it was a problem, but it wasn't really there yet. And Shays' Rebellion. So key points, I think I'll sum up, and then again we can get into a divide on it. So Western territories, they had to decide how they were going to bring new states into the Union. So the 1787 Northwest Ordinance established how new territories would enter the Union, and basically set up the idea that the states would be divided up into parcels of land, because the original fear was that the big states like Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, the states that had borders to the west, would expand into these territories and take all of them. And of course, states.
And the more people you have, the more represented. Well, this would become later, right? The more representatives
you become later. Yeah, but they were still worried about size. Obviously, it's going to be more influential if you're a bigger state in terms of the Union. Even though you all had one vote each, it was clear that with the threat to invade Rhode Island, the bigger states would have more, and they just didn't want more influence from these, and especially the southern states expanding would bring slavery into more areas. So in order to avoid that, the government basically designed the idea that states would be able to set up their own, new states would be set up once they received a certain number of people. They could set up their own governments. Once they received a certain amount of people, they could apply to become states into the territories.
So they needed 60,000 settlers to then become an actual state.
Yeah, and that would then balance up, and that then creates itself a new problem, because by deciding that they would be new states that were entering, that then became like, well, would these new states then be slave or non-slave states, and how would they be set up inside there? So even by doing something, they don't kind of end up fixing that problem.
Well, they do that. The Northwest Ordinance does it. It avoids that problem, doesn't it?
Well,
because it actually draws a line. It says no slavery would be allowed north of the Ohio. So
yes,
drawing a line.
Like, yes, but that doesn't really solve. That only kicks the can down the road.
Kicks the can down the road. That's right. But also, it's both pro and anti-slavery. The Northwest Ordinance, right? Because it's anti-slavery. Yeah, it has to be.
Yeah.
So it specifies states where slavery is not allowed, but on the other hand, fugitive slaves can't take refuge in a free state. The slave owners have the right to go into that state and reclaim their property. Right.
Yeah. Fugitive Slave Act, and this obviously ends up.
This becomes very important with Dred Scott later on.
We'll get there. And that, and the Missouri Compromise, and like the Kansas blood feuds, and all the other stuff. They're all in the 19th century course that we don't study, but are vitally important for the middle. We will do one in the 19th century, but we'll do covering the main.
But the important thing is that the Northwest Ordinance, from what I've read, maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to be particularly controversial.
No, it solves it in the short. What I would always say,
solves it in the short term.
Yeah, but kicks the can down the road and ends up creating the problems that end up causing the Civil War. So even it's only, and this is why it's quite funny, because they do the same thing under Washington's government. So the Western territories, albeit being the most successful thing that the Articles of Confederation does in the short term, kicks the can down the road to cause the Civil War. And in the new government, they do the same thing. Whereas in the Articles of Federation, it's their biggest success. This is the irony, because it's the only thing that isn't a total failure.
But hang on, James. Don't they win the War of Independence
under the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah.
Yes, but I would say that's more Britain leaving and French intervention than it was
Okay, so that
UK
leads into the other
leaving.
questions
Yeah,
we've already
rather
discussed.
than
No, but
the amazing American Articles of Confederation. I think they win it despite the Articles of Confederation rather than because of it.
I
Because
see.
yeah,
Okay.
they were constantly running out of money. Washington couldn't arm his soldiers. They didn't give anything. There was no mandatory requirement to donate to the Continental Army. So I don't think Washington would have said, "Yeah, we won it because of the amazing support we got from the Articles of Confederation government."
It's funny though, because I mean I have there's a kind of, I like to take the underdog side
Yeah,
sometimes in the argument. I make a case for the Articles of Confederation.
yeah. Go on, make a case. Do
Um,
you want to make a case for
well,
that?
I mean, I think that that in hindsight, historically, and even to some extent, at the time, people wanted to really make an argument against it, right? That's in
Well, they
order to
had
have the
to. Yeah, of course,
Constitution,
they
you have
had
to
to
show why the
because
Articles of Confederation are insufficient.
yes, and obviously they want to write. As American history is all about the winners, and of course, once they have the new federal government, they're going to talk about how terrible the previous
Yeah.
form of government was. But I
And,
think they've got enough
and
ammunition.
you should read the Anti-Federalists, I guess, for the other side, right?
Yeah, but I think, but they weren't even really pro. That was one of the big, and when we get to that, that was one of the big problems of the Anti-Federalists. The only thing they had to offer, they didn't have an alternative other than more of the Articles of Confederation that clearly wasn't working. So I don't know. I mean, you could argue that maybe they could have just the Articles of Confederation would it have stopped the Civil War? I don't know. But America certainly wouldn't be the country it was today if they'd stayed with the Articles of Confederation. That's for sure.
Impossible to say in alternate historical realities. Yeah, very
Yeah,
hard to say.
but highly unlikely given what they needed to get it done. So the Western Territories is a fudge, basically. It's like a we won't allow slavery in the North because then they're thinking that's fine because most of the new territories in the North. So eventually we're going to end up with lots of non-slave states and eventually slavery will die a death. What they don't anticipate is America winning the Mexican-American War in 1848 and taking all of the southern Texas and all the
Yeah,
southern states.
right.
And then they're like, oh crap, this doesn't work anymore because now we've got a lot of new territories south of the Missouri
So
Conflict.
with the it's a bit about how you answer it, how you want to frame the question too, right?
Yeah.
Because if you want to talk about sort of practical problems at the time, then I think they solved the problem of the Western Territories quite well with the Northwestern Ordinance.
At that time,
If,
yeah, they
if you want to
sold.
talk about it from a moral point of view,
Yeah,
then you might object to it because obviously it doesn't abolish slavery and perpetuates it. Or if you want to think about, later issues in a more long-term
yeah.
view in the next 100 years, then it's going to be an issue as well. Although this gets tricky, right? Because is it just the Northwest Ordinance, or is it the fact that there are a bunch of other agreements like the Missouri Compromise and all, that come
I
along
think they
later
all
that
stem
add,
from the
add
same
different
point.
problems?
Yeah, but they all stem from the same idea, which is
Same,
how do we
yeah,
avoid a conflict between the slave and the non-slave states? And the idea is you don't, you just postpone it. It's gonna come at some point, and eventually it does with the Civil War. So, but the one thing you could argue is I don't think the Articles. One thing I would give, I don't think the Articles of Confederation were any worse than the Washington presidency dealing with the Western territories. So even if you argue that they were weak in
yeah.
dealing with them,
Or the Constitution, the Constitution. It's not.
yeah,
Yeah,
everything. Nothing.
absolutely.
No one. No, this problem is never dealt with, like at all, until the Civil War, and even after the
Yeah,
Civil War, like when we go into Native American history and African American history, we will see that this problem, the frontier in the West, doesn't really go away until they basically kill everyone, and then it kind of ends up. I think it just morphs. I think this Western territory idea morphs into the urban rural divide again in its own way. But I think the strain is still there. So I think you could argue, yes, it's very effective in the short term of dealing with the problem because
yeah.
it is just kicking the can down the road, and that's fundamentally why it's not so strong. And then we look at the second problem, which is Shays' Rebellion. Obviously, the the Shay is an ex-soldier. was not paid for his work in the War of Independence. And then a lot of these ex-soldiers are farmers or were farmers, and they're in debt and they can't pay their debt back to the creditors in the urban cities in the east. And the fact that they can't pay their creditors means they want to print money. The government is putting pressure to stop them from printing money to inflate it away. And a lot of them are, it's not really their fault, really. They're not being, if they were paid their salary, they would be able to basically pay back their debts. And this is another fundamental problem with the bank, because you've got the bank, the debt, because the national debt is there. They don't have the money to pay the soldiers, and because they can't pay the soldiers can't pay their debts, and because the soldiers can't pay their debts, they're having their farms confiscated. And of course, this is seen as an injustice by them. So Shea, how much he led it and how much he was just part of it is another. They wanted to name it because it makes it easier for them to deal with it. They name
Well, he
it.
gets let off, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. So like, it's named after him, but it's not clear that he was leading it. You know what I mean? It's just
Well,
basically.
presumably, this was what puzzled me when I read it. I thought that if he was one of the leaders, presumably he'd be one of the ones that execute.
Yeah, I think they didn't
No.
catch him, so I think there was a certain sympathy as well in the among the Jeffersonian coalition of rural farmers. There's obviously a lot
Yeah.
of sympathy for Shea because he's and in his own way. I mean, surely Shea's rebellion is kind of a continuation of the American grievances against the British. I mean, it's basically like you're trying to take money, confiscate our property. I'm fighting for my rights. The Bill of Rights later on says you cannot confiscate property unfairly, and I think in a modern court they would say if you're not being paid, it's like it's not really fair. But like, um, obviously the wealthy merchants are putting pressure on farmers to pay back their debt in hard currency. They don't have any hard currency because the only people who've got that are merchants, because only with Britain can they trade it, and they haven't got full trade back with Britain yet. That's another problem under the Articles of Confederation. They were limited in their trade negotiations. Um, and there was an armed rebellion. Say 1,500 armed farmers blocked off the courthouse. They marched on it and they tried to, but they weren't trying to overthrow the government. That's the key bit. They were just trying to stop farms from being confiscated, which they considered to be legit because they are not being paid. And the merchants had to pay for a private army to put down this rebellion. This is because, again, the government under the Articles of Confederation did not have an army. And that one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, two of the fundamental weaknesses is they can't raise taxes and they don't have an army. And they can't raise taxes means they can't pay the soldiers, which means that leads to this rebellion because the national debt can't be paid off. And then the fact they don't have an army means they can't put the rebellion down. So I think ultimately this
I
is a
think
real sign of weakness.
yeah, I think the major factor in Shea's rebellion, it's not that there was a rebellion. It's
Yeah.
the fact that the Massachusetts government couldn't had didn't have a militia at hand to stop it, and that they had to pay a private army. I think that's the problem in particular. It's sort of shocking. I mean, I can imagine it'd be quite a shocking,
Yeah.
you know,
I think it was one of the
problem.
key reasons why the elites called for a constitution for a stronger federal government.
It
Because
shows how weak you are.
yeah, and
I
I
mean,
think they're not really worried about the government per se, but they are worried about their own private property.
it's like
They're
it's
like,
like
we need the
James,
government to protect it.
yeah, yeah, and it's like if you're in the classroom and one kid is causing you problems and he walks all over you,
Yeah.
then what are the others going to do, James?
Well, there, yeah, it will just. But again, did they did they see it yet? It wasn't a federal government yet, so maybe the other states would have gone, "That's not our problem," or maybe they would have looked at it and gone, "Damn, that might come to us." Obviously,
Right,
Massachusetts had a bigger problem with this than some of the other states
because
because it was where the war was fought. So it was Massachusetts, and then in the South, in Georgia and South Carolina, because they'd had a lot of fighting on their territory. There was a lot more disruption to their economies than, say, like Connecticut, where there was no real fighting.
but you didn't like my analogy, I take it, because
Of
I
the
wanted to
of the
kick.
students walking all over. Yeah, obviously, like if your authority goes. I mean, did the Articles of Federation ever have any authority at all? Though that's the question.
So the Constitution would be like the federal government would be like the school principal coming in.
Well, it'd be like
Like,
giving you tools to discipline them. So if they
yeah,
did that, there would be a punishment, and then they're less likely to do it. And if and also giving me a salary. No, no. But
I hope you're listening, James's students.
yeah, well, you wanted to start a rebellion in the class. I think it would not an advisable point of view. If they've got a legit grievance, I'll, I'll listen to it. If they're, but yeah,
Sorry, I'm having too much fun. Keep going.
that's
Keep
fine. I'm
going.
not sure the analogy
Proceed.
will hold up on that
At
one.
your expense, James, at your expense.
Do you think any positives to the Shays Rebellion? I think it just shows the Articles of Federations. I think ultimately shows the two biggest weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. They can't tax, so they can't raise revenue. They don't have an army, so they can't deal with internal rebellions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's critical. So very badly is the conclusion.
And also say again, who the hell, the other states, are they going to care? There's a rebellion in the back country of Massachusetts, not really. So they can't.
Well, but James, they might because if you can rebel in one state, it's a bit like in 1848 in the revolutions. Like if one group succeeds in its demands, then other similar groups will be emboldened to do that. I think all of the states have an interest.
Yeah, that's true. And it's Massachusetts first, as always. So
they're a bunch of lunatics.
Yes. Oh.
I'm sorry. No,
as my politics colleague who's from Massachusetts says, massholes. No, that's not.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. And then economic problems was the third problem. So of course there was one, but the economy of the former colonies was thriving. So trade was back, which obviously was there. And transatlantic trade was back at the end of the war, so they could trade out a little bit. But of course, their economies had been ruined by the war itself. And obviously they had to get everything back up and running outside. So they were struggling with a little bit of recession this time period as well. But the weakness from it, again, there was the national debt and they couldn't raise revenue because they can't have tariffs. They're not allowed to do that either. And they can't raise taxes. So if you can't put up tariffs and you can't raise taxes, how exactly do you get money? It's only from voluntary contributions. And as anyone knows, no one is going to voluntarily contribute to tax.
I think it's worth remembering just one important difference, and that's that the Articles of Confederation, they get their money with the states levy taxes, right, in the states.
Yeah.
And then they make a contribution to.
But it's voluntary. I think they don't have to contribute. So I think they give what they want to give.
Right, and the obligation is somewhat sketchy, isn't it? Which would mean, if you lived in a share house and you said there's just a voluntary contribution to the share house kitty, then you can imagine lots of people not going to be very judicious about that.
Some people will do it. People with like a good social conscience will do it, but most of these states were like every man for himself. So I don't think they would. It's not.
Maybe it's a bit like maybe a bit like
NATO. It's like NATO. Yeah, with its 2%.
Yeah, like NATO. Like NATO. So this is getting
where everyone freeloads off the back.
Yeah.
Trump would not have been a fan of the Articles of Confederation.
No. But it's worth remembering that, one very, very important thing that the federal government, once the Constitution is formed and implemented, it means that the federal government can tax directly the people of the United States. It doesn't have to get some kind of. It's not that the states levy taxes and then pay the federal government. The federal government levies taxes directly.
Yeah,
I think it's a very important remedy to this problem.
Yeah,
so
and it's still that they have to fight to establish that. But of course, they have the right to tax according to the Constitution, and they have the right to raise an army. So that allows them to both enforce these things. And tariffs, they can raise trade tariffs because they'll have a federal government. So at the moment, all trade is just being tariffed in the individual ports at state level. Although this, of course, probably that state and federal divide probably means the Americans get taxed more than a lot of people because they get taxed at multiple levels, whereas we don't at the same level.
So the tariffs are important, right? Because there's Great Britain, all of its trade empire.
Yeah.
And so if you're competing with much bigger entities, then you're at a bit of it. Well, it depends, right? It depends from what point of view you're taking. But from the point of view of manufacturing specifically, then you're at a disadvantage.
Yeah, because they can manufacture much cheaper products and they can
just do it cheaper. Yeah, it's a question of
scale. Yeah. They've got a larger scale manufacturing base and more, they've been doing it for ages. And of course, America doesn't have a manufacturing base built up yet because they weren't allowed to manufacture under mercantilism. So it took them time to build that up. So yeah, as you were saying, the manufacturers needed tariffs to protect their products from European competition, so they would be flooding the market, and also they could raise money off those tariffs, so that tariffs would add to the taxation to be able to generate it. Creditors need to restrict the printing of paper money. So state legislatures, where they were deciding, obviously state legislatures on the popular vote, as we've talked about before, there were more debtors and creditors, so they're not going to vote to restrict that, and it's not in their interest to do so. The people who lent government money wanted protection, so protection of their money by not allowing it to be inflated away, but also, as they saw from Shays Rebellion, literal protection of their property from the consequences of this. Slave owners wanted protection of their property, so that was the other problem, which was kind of solved by the Fugitive Slave Act, but the idea of making sure that slavery was retained. And there was a strong need for a common tax to be able to raise and actually pay for stuff, because without funding, a government can't do anything. As Britain and France's debt ended up with the French Revolution. Britain's debt problems in the 7 Years' War led to independence. They had clear examples of where debt failed to be able to generate anything afterwards. And I think basically the Articles of Confederation was fundamentally unable to deal with any of these economic problems. If the economy was good, it was good, but they couldn't actually contribute anything to it because they didn't have the right to tax, raise tariffs, or raise an army.
That's right. It's actually interesting, the array of interests aligned to have a constitution.
Yeah.
Right. Think of the vastly different situation in the South with these plantation slave crop economy. But the slave states are very concerned. They want protection for slaves. They want guarantees. Right. So they actually have their own set of interests, which just happen to align at this point. For example, what happens if a slave, if in the Articles of Confederation, what happens if a slave escapes? What do you do?
Well, you can hire a private army. There's no federal enforcement because there's no army.
No federal enforcement. No, that's the key, right? There's no federal enforcement.
Yeah.
No, surely you maybe get a private eye to track your runaway slave. No, but I'm just saying from their point of view, you can see why a federal government which has the capacity to a kind of militia force that you can enlist, that's important for Southern interests, just as it is for manufacturers in the North who want manufacturing protected. Tariffs.
I think it was in the interest of a lot of it. I think what aligns here initially is that even like the rural areas and the farmers, they need the national government to have tax to be able to pay them so they can save their farms. So even though there's a conflict of interest in there, I think most people realize this. I think you can't really argue. The Articles of Confederation was not a functional state. And obviously another big problem that was happening this time is related economically, is Britain was picking off colonies one by one. So it would go to Connecticut and say, how much do you want to pay us for this? And then go to New York and say, all right, Connecticut's offering this. Can you offer more? And they would play them off against each other because they didn't have any unity of because they didn't have any
collective action problem. It's basically the collective action problem.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the biggest fundamental unities, was they were like, well, it's divide and conquer. Was they brought back, the Federalists brought back that Benjamin Franklin drawing of the snake cut into 13 pieces and said, like, unite or die.
Right.
But it's basically, that's how America conducts its foreign policy now, pitting Latin American countries against each other or African countries against each other, divide and conquer. The only place America can't do that to, or couldn't do that to, was the European Union, because the strength in numbers of Europe was stronger.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, I don't single out America. I mean, it's just a tried and true. Read Machiavelli.
Yeah. But America builds itself.
That is politics. That's politics. That's what you do.
Yeah, but America's a master.
Political parties do it against each other.
Yeah. Yes. The lowest qualities of human nature. But like Are we going to make any argument in favor of the Articles of Confederation, or is it pretty clear that it's just pretty much the only thing it did?
I would say, if you're interested in doing that, read the Anti-Federalists.
Okay.
Because there is a case to be made against a strong federal government and much stronger state legislatures, right? Now, and what we haven't talked about.
But that's still not a pro that's not a pro Articles of Confederation article. That's just basically saying it's worse the other one. But we still need to, like, is there any way you could argue that the Articles of Confederation is a strong form of government?
Well, it's pro in a way. Um, so, yeah. But I think it's easier. It's generally easier to say that it wasn't working very well. I think that the kind of grain, the grain in this question runs a bit more easily with suggesting that I would say the Western Territories did that pretty well, but Shays' Rebellion, the economic problems, it did it badly, and that was critical.
Yeah, I think the Western Territories was just a short-term fix, and it's like a band-aid over a gaping wound. It didn't really solve it in the long term either. So even its only success was not that successful if you're thinking about the long term. And the other two, I think, would pretty much, they were just they were handicapped.
Yeah.
The ability not being able to tax and not being able to raise tariffs and not being able to negotiate treaties and not being able to have an army and having to have unanimous 13 votes meant basically it couldn't deal with any of those other problems.
Except I disagree with the characterization that's a gaping wound, because I think that's a bit I think it's reading things from a bit of a teleological perspective. I just don't, it's not clear yet that it's going to be a biggie. I don't think it's clear yet. It's evident.
Is it not? Even Jefferson at the time was saying that this is going to be the fire of slavery, is the fire in the night. It's going to lead to like a civil war. I think they saw it. I think that they were doing everything they could to avoid it because they saw it coming.
Yeah. Well, there's a basic paradox that you needed to gloss over these issues in order to have a constitution.
Yeah.
But then once you have it, you have this massive rift.
Yeah, I mean, but those divides are not going away. Those divides, and I think those divides have been there pretty much most of them since the beginning of this course, since 1740. It's just, again, as we talked about in the other ones, they're there, they're around. They just become more and more like, it's just the more this progresses as a kind of story, the more those divides become obvious. They become open. People can see them. They can deal with them. I think that's the difference.
Okay.
Cool. Shall we go? I'll stop this.